This is 5 Questions with Dr. Kent Peacock. I wanted to say at the beginning that I'm very happy to be here, and it's a great pleasure for me to interview Dr. Peacock. We actually go back a long way, farther than I'd like to admit. Kent is a former instructor of mine and a current mentor and friend. Many years ago, he was my logic professor at the University of Toronto, just after he finished his dissertation. And since then, we've reconnected, which is very nice for me, and he's helping me with my PhD dissertation. My name is Gary Graham. I'm a grad student at the University of Toronto in the Institute for History and Philosophy of Science and Technology, and also, like Kent, a philosopher of physics. Kent is a professor of philosophy at the University of Lethbridge. He's been there since 1996, having graduated from U of T with a PhD in philosophy in 1991. Much of his work is in the history and philosophy of science, with excursions into symbolic logic, but he has a strong interest in environmental issues and has published on sustainability and climate. Welcome, Kent.
Hello, Gary, and hello, everybody else. And I'm very honored and pleased to have the chance to do this. So, I understand you got some questions for me, so let's dive in. Okay,
let's plunge in. So, I've been thinking about our discussion yesterday that we had, and I wanted to ask you about an issue that's of importance to both of us in philosophy of physics, specifically the foundations of quantum theory. As you know, there have always been two camps, two conflicting points of view about the ontological status of the wave function. The first one, the epistemic interpretation, avers that the wave function provides insight into our ignorance of a quantum system, such as an electron. Conversely, the ontic interpretation avers that the wave function is the system, is constitutive of the system. I'm very curious about where you stand on this issue. Do you come down on one side or the other, or do you think it's a false dichotomy?
Okay, well, it's something I've been thinking about for years, and it's a very difficult question. And, you know, let's not forget we're philosophers, right? We're philosophers who dabble in physics, but philosophers first. So we have to think about what's the relationship between theory and reality. We have these very wonderful descriptions of reality that physics gives us, and they work amazingly well, you know, and you know, some people have said unreasonably well, and why? And that's an interesting question. So talking about the wave function in particular, we don't want to get too technical here, but the wave function is a way of calculating the probability that things will happen. And depending on the type of experiment or situation you're looking at, sometimes it has the form of a wave. Actually, it's not always a wave. It has a more abstract description. and I think okay, short answer to your question, I think it's epistemic. I think it's a way of encoding knowledge about the system. And you could compare it sort of to, well, my example is, say you turn on the news tonight and it says a crime wave is sweeping the city. Well, what's actually happening is for some reason, there's an increased frequency of break and enters or whatever it was going across the city. But each individual event is a discrete event. And, but the probability of it for some reason has increased. No, and there's going to be a reason why that happened, right? But we can describe it mathematically as a wave. So I think that the same thing happens in quantum physics or particle physics, although it's more complicated, that there are probability waves, and but what we're actually seeing is discrete events, detection of an electron here or a photon over there. But so the interesting question then is, what is the relationship between this abstract mathematical tool, if you like, descriptive tool, and the reality. And that's, of course, a really, really deep question. If something we were talking about last night, I think that many of the thinkers, including Einstein himself, they just got kind of impatient. They felt, yeah, we have to have the answer to this. We must know what this is immediately. So they kept trying to go back to things that they were familiar with, and being very, very insistent that no, it has to be like a Newtonian mechanics at some deep level. And I think that at some deep level, it's far weirder than anything we've been able to conceptualize yet. But in the meantime, we have this very powerful math that provides us with a descriptive modality that it's just a very, very useful tool. And anyway, this is sort of an answer, I hope, to your question. No, so so I wouldn't say it's a false dichotomy. I'd say it's primarily epistemic, but why? The question is, why does it work? And that's a really interesting question.
I remember you saying that yesterday when we were talking. And the issue is the question is about the wave function. And so really I'm asking about the ontological status of the particle or the quantum system before measurement. So what exactly is that status on your view? I mean, it's not a particle with a particular momentum and a particular position. Those dynamic properties seem not to exist before measurement. So really, that's the issue I have.
Sure, and it's a very good question. This drove Albert Einstein absolutely crazy. So he played a major role in creating quantum mechanics, and then he sort of hated it. He wanted to disown his own child, sort of thing. But my understanding, and there's still debate about this among very expert people, so you could probably get some people here who would say I'm completely wrong, but my understanding is that quantum mechanics says we don't have the right to say what the system is doing between observations. So if you see an electron here and you see it over here a little time later, classically we want to say, no, the electron had a continuous path. It went by. It's sort of like watching a bird fly behind a cloud and then come out the other side. You figure the bird is still there, just disappeared behind the cloud for a second. But quantum mechanics says, no, in general, we're not entitled to make that assumption. And there's a whole flock of results, so-called no-go results, which basically show that if you make that assumption, if you assume that the system has a continuous realistic existence in between observations, you actually get the wrong predictions. It's just wrong. It just doesn't work. So you say, well, damn it, what is the truth? I must know the truth. And yeah, I agree. That's a good question, but let's not be impatient. Just let us be instructed by nature here and understand what it's trying to tell us. It may not be something we like. And that's similar with the climate issues that I also talk about as well. By and large, the news from nature is telling us things that we don't want to hear.
I remember this from yesterday's discussion, that you feel strongly that it's okay to be agnostic. And in fact, that's the intellectually honest position. Until the data come in, it's better to be agnostic.
Well, that's the view of one of the philosophers I admire the most, David Hume. And Hume, I mean, you can quibble one way or the other about the details of some of his particular arguments, but I think his overall viewpoint was very, very wise, which is, look, we are humans. We are, we only know so much. We are mayflies. We have a short span of life on this earth. And there's a lot of things we don't know. Maybe some things we'll never know. And so just have to be honest with ourselves and say, okay, for example, we don't really know what happens to us after death. Does our consciousness just snuff out like an old light bulb, or Is there something else? And people have all kinds of views about that, right? And the fact is, we don't know. So just admit that and live with it. And so Hume taught that we can still live decent lives even in a condition of uncertainty about major issues. And that's, I think, to me, a wiser and more humble and healthier attitude. So getting back to quantum mechanics, there's a whole bunch of stuff we just, we're learning, every day, little pieces of the puzzle keep getting put in place, but it's a really big puzzle, and maybe I won't finish it in my lifetime, so that's the way it is.
It's funny, I remember talking to you about Hume in the old days back at U of T many years ago. I think you said the same thing. Okay, well, this seems to me to lead to a more general topic, the issue of whether theoretical physics. You told me that you feel the current development in physics is a matter of refinement rather than discovery, and this has consequences in many areas, including climate change. So can you elucidate this notion a little?
I have a lot of agreement with Lee Smolin, who's a very brilliant theoretical physicist at the University of Waterloo, or actually at Perimeter Institute in Waterloo, Ontario. And Smolin has argued that he's got a famous book called The Trouble with Physics. And partially it's a critique of string theory, but more important, his claim is that you'd have to go back to the, say, early 1970s before you'd see the last real advance in understanding of physics. And theoretical physics has been kind of hung up for a long time. A lot of people work on string theory. It's enormously complex mathematically, but string theory, for all the money and effort spent on it, hasn't produced any testable predictions. Well, actually, the only major prediction it's made is so far not looking very good. Was the existence of, without getting, it's something called supersymmetry, which is supposed to be in the modern package. And the Large Hadron Collider in Europe is finding zero evidence of supersymmetry. And they're getting a little worried about that right now. So anyway, so the question is, now if you go back to the history, like say 1900 to say 1950s or 60s, there's a tremendous progress, right? And Einstein, Schrodinger, and all those people, and they're coming up with all these amazing discoveries, and the discoveries are testable. They're, somebody predicts a new particle, and then they go out and they discover it, right? And they get another Nobel Prize or something. But but there's been very little of that since the 70s, and the only things that have come up since the 70s are things like dark energy, which are reminders that we still don't know what's going on. So, the question is why? Why this lack of progress? And it's a complex question, but part of it could even be pointed to, you could point to sociological or economic factors. Young scientists, by and large, these days are taught to be very, very risk averse, and they don't want to take intellectual risks. And Smolin talks about that. I think that's part of it. I think also there's a intellectual conservatism within theoretical physics itself. I think there's been a lot of conservatism about non-locality in quantum mechanics. Now, we haven't got time to really get into that in proper explanation, but something I've worked on quite a bit. And there's just as there's climate denial, there's also what I call non-locality denial. There's sort of like, oh, this couldn't be true, and people try and come up with all kinds of complicated workarounds to avoid non-locality. That's a very large discussion, and we can't do justice to it in this interview. But now, how does it relate to the things like climate and so forth? Well, okay, so ask yourself, why are we still using? Why is 80 to 85% of the world's energy use still dependent on fossil fuels, coal, oil, and gas? I mean, they've served us well. I've burned my share of diesel fuel in my lifetime, right? But still, their time is up, obviously, partially because of climate change and partially because of depletion of the highest quality reserves. There's still lots of fossil fuels left in the world, but they're increasingly of they have much lower energy return. So it's just more expensive in resources to extract them and process them, and so we run our society on the excess of the so if you have to get oil out of the ground, it costs you some energy to do that, and then hopefully there's some excess that you can use to do everything else we do, and that people have done the math on this, that excess energy is significantly going down from what it was even 20 or 30 years ago, let alone 1960s and 70s. Anyway, so, and then you have climate, which is really, really critical. So we have to get off fossil fuels sooner or later. Sooner the better. And so why haven't we got an alternative? You know, as the joke goes, where's my Jetsons car? Remember the Jetsons, you know, cartoons I used to watch when I was a kid, back, you know, the amazing car that goes like that, sort of flies around and does all these amazing things and folds up into a briefcase, right? So nanotech plus infinite amount of energy available all in one package. So I think part of the problem is that physics is stalled. That we're, you know, we haven't got really good alternatives to fossil fuels. Now, the one area where there has been progress, significant progress, of course, is in improving the efficiency of renewables and batteries, and all those, and a lot of the progress, for example, in coming up with better solar cells and things like that. These basically trace back to quantum mechanics. It's basically applied quantum mechanics based on insights discovered mostly in the 1920s, right? And we're still cashing out the insights of people like Schrodinger and Einstein himself and a bunch of others who had these amazing advances back then. But why haven't we got nuclear fusion working, for example? Well, it is a very, very difficult problem, no question about that. But also, and it's also, you could argue it's been underfunded. But but also, again, I would think there's issues in theoretical understanding that I think more intellectual innovation is needed in certain areas, and people aren't making those innovations. And it's not that we're not as smart as we used to be. I think there's a lot. You look at our students, man, we got some really smart students, you know, and that's one of the great pleasures of teaching, is to the smart people you run into, you know, but somehow they're not able to apply their creativity to the right problems. And I don't have an answer to that. So
you don't have an answer in the sense that you don't know what the underlying cause for that is?
Well, I can hypothesize. I've got all kinds of views as to why. Okay, why don't we have, you know, nuclear fusion working right now, so we wouldn't need coal anymore? Okay, and people have been working on nuclear fusion since World War II. It still isn't anywhere near usable for practical power generation. And why not? And it's, again, it's a really complicated story, but I mean, to me, the broader question is the greatest resource that any human society has is the creativity of its people, and it's not just that, you know, oh, we have, you know, oil or timber or something like that. Those are our resources. Well, that's true, but the greatest resource is human creativity, and that's where the investment should be going.
So you feel then that there is something like an intellectual inertia, certainly if Smolin is to be believed, that the continued discovery has slowed down.
That's what I'm seeing. And even though many people are working on these problems, but and they are hard. I mean, fusion, for example, it is just technically very hard problem, right? But we're missing something that they had back in the 1920s. And what is that? You tell me. I'm posing this as a problem. I think that this is to me, the thing that I find most important. See, let me come at this from another angle. This is something that I've been giving a lot of thought to, and it relates again to the things I talked about in my lecture back in 2017. Is if you look at the history of the evolution of the human species, it's a really interesting question. So humans of some sort have been around for hundreds of thousands of years. And then for some reason, unclear reason, about 50, 60, 70,000 years ago, one branch of the human family had some kind of neurological step in its evolution and becomes incredibly innovative. And so they're producing new things. And see, this is the thing that I find philosophically fascinating, is that when okay, so there's a wonderful example from paleoanthropology. I did some reading on this. The sewing needle. The earliest sewing needles appear in human remains something like 30,000 years ago. There were no sewing needles before that point. And it's been pointed out by anthropologists that this is actually a very significant innovation, right? Because guess what? It allows you to make tailored clothing. And if you're living in Ice Age Europe, 25 or 30,000 years ago, the ability to create clothing that fits well is a very powerful survival tool. But the interesting thing is, as I say, tool-making humans have been around for hundreds of thousands of years. But before a certain point, there was no sewing needle. Didn't exist. Now it exists. Before a certain point, there was no transistor. Now they're all over the place. We're using them to have this interview, lots of them, right? This to me is just philosophically the fascinating point is that, people say, oh, there's nothing new in the earth. That's not really true. I mean, there can be new things and they're produced by human creativity. And we got to get that going for ourselves in a much bigger way, because we're at a situation now where what we've been doing, it's got us by. We've had lots of fun. We've done some cool things and put people on the moon and everything else. But we're hitting the wall on this now. We can't continue this complex society with all the environmental impacts it's having, using the present, among other things, the means of energy. And there's other things too. It's a whole question of sustainability is a very large discussion. But we need some new ideas. And so we still have lots of creative people, right? Just look at our students, right? We have lots of creative people. We need to create the milieu, the conditions that allows them to exercise their creativity. And, that's far more important to me than just talking about any particular innovations in fusion or quantum non-locality or any of those other incredibly cool things, is just this question of how do we plug into that motor of creativity.
That's interesting. I have thought often over the last 5 or 6 years that there's a growing anti-intellectualism, not only in North America, but really everywhere. And perhaps that's connected to this lack of, forward movement in discovery.
Well, the anti-intellectualism, for example, is manifested obviously in the president who shall not be named. Maybe there's two things going on here. And look, I'm a mere philosopher. I know I'm the most ignorant man in Athens. All right, so but first of all, you see this with respect to climate. There are powerful corporate forces who are deliberately using the fear and resentment and ignorance of large masses of people to get their own ends. So you see this in climate science denial, for example, which is by and large engineered, and by lift up the hood or look behind the curtain, and you'll see the oil companies, or some of the oil companies at least, deliberately over many years have been funding misinformation about climate and then you can get a president who says, I just don't believe in climate. I just don't believe it. Right. But this is partially something that's very cynically engineered. Now, the other thing is, but what they're doing, and what the president should not be named, what he's doing is they're tapping into a genuine stratum of fear and anger and resentment of people all over the world who are feeling dispossessed, who are feeling they're scared. I mean, they don't necessarily have PhDs in climate science, but they're aware that things are not quite right, and they don't see a future. See, back in the '60s, I mean, I'm old enough to remember the '60s, and how, despite Vietnam and everything else, it just seemed like a time of promise and hope, and technology is going to, all these cool things are going to happen, and then something went wrong, and there isn't that sense. There's a sense now, I think, among many young people that the very best thing that humanity can hope to do is sort of hold on. People don't honestly see a future, and it's essentially it's ecological. People are picking up on the ecological stresses. They're aware of this. So they call it the right wing, or for lack of a better word, taps into this fear and resentment, and one of the classic things is shoot the messenger. So if a climate scientist gives you bad news, it must be a conspiracy. It must, they're just trying to impose socialism or something like that. So it's probably ultimately some kind of ecological thing, but with some cynical forces taking advantage of it for their own ends.
So in light of those assertions that you've made about the feeling of hopelessness and so on, what do you think is the role of intellectuals or of philosophers or university professors in fighting that or providing an alternative?
Partially, it's to do what Socrates talked about: be the gadfly, be the gadfly of your society, which he insisted that is good for the society. To be the critic, to ask awkward questions, right? And there's a reason why gadflies in many societies, it's a very dangerous occupation in some countries in the world, to be a critic or to be asked too many questions. I mean, being a journalist, for example, is one of the most dangerous occupations in the world. They're regularly murdered and so forth. So the other thing that I think philosophers can do, excuse me, is try to, and this is actually where I sometimes disagree with some of my fellow philosophers, because many philosophers today, they're sort of obsessed with analysis, like this incredibly searching analysis of how do I know I really have a head, and or something like that, right? And you can read books and books on that, and that's fine. That's a good intellectual exercise.
One remembers Moore's response to that question. G.E. Moore, who said, how do I know I have hands? Well, shut the hell up. Of course you have hands.
Yeah, well, there's some use in that. But what I would also want to, although Moore, well, let's not get into Moore too much, but anyway, but what I would also want to see is, I think philosophers need to provide some more positive, imaginative visions of where we could be going. And now they have to be well informed. You have to do your homework. So, which I tried to do. I, kind of a slow learner, but I try and, pick a few things up.
There's no disputing that you're very well informed, Kent. And, it's interesting that you talk about Socrates in this light, because Socrates' philosophy is really very optimistic. And, I think it's probably wrong, or it's mostly wrong. And as philosophers, we haven't replaced Socrates' philosophy with another philosophy that is optimistic to the same degree. Do you agree with that?
Well, it's interesting that you say he's optimistic. I literally hadn't thought of it in those terms, but in a sense, I think that's right. So in the Apology, Apology of Socrates, one of the things he says is that the most interesting thing is to investigate human virtue. Okay, now when you translate, so the trouble is, the word we say virtue in the ancient Greek, it's another word, and the word they actually used was a word that doesn't mean virtue in the modern sense. So it's a mistranslation. The word that they used meant something like characteristic excellence. So what Socrates was really saying is, at least the way I read it, is the most worthwhile thing to do is think on how human beings can be excellent in their own characteristic way. Humans are capable of great excellence, despite all of the dumb things we do and the cruel things we do and the stupid things we do. We're capable of some very great excellence as well. And that's worth understanding. We need to understand how that works. He wasn't just talking about moral virtue. He was talking about excellence in a broader sense, which includes moral virtue, but includes, well,
scientific insight.
Yeah, a whole bunch of things like that. Yeah. So,
all right. So you've written an interesting paper on the "Where are they" problem. I believe the title is "Fermi and Locke: the long odds of survival in a dangerous universe." Can you give us a précis of that article?
Okay, so this is just something that I've always been fascinated with. The question, is there life out there? As a little kid, I used to, camping or something, you lie in my sleeping bag looking at the stars at night and wonder if anybody out there was looking back at us, and it's one of the most fascinating questions, at least to many people. I mean, I've talked to some very smart people who think that this whole discussion of life on other worlds is a total waste of time. They think it's irrelevant. I don't agree with them. So because, I think that curiosity is one of the big components of creativity. Well, anyway, let me just get back to Fermi, and I'll try and link these up. So Enrico Fermi, of course, was a famous Italian-American physicist. And back around 1950 or so, he and his friends were sitting around the lunch table at Los Alamos reading newspaper reports of UFO sightings. And they sort of got joking about this whole question of, is there life out there? And Fermi had an amazing ability to do back of the envelope estimates, and he often very accurate. So he starts doodling on a napkin or table napkin or something, and immediately says, well, where are they? Because what he just did was a very simple calculation of, even in 1950, they could make reasonable estimates of the number of stars that are out there and the number of planetary systems that might exist and how old the universe is. And you throw those few of those figures in, do a little bit of arithmetic, you say that the probability is virtually 100% that the aliens ought to have been here by now. And yet, unless you believe UFO reports, which are, shall we say, unreliable at best, there's no clear evidence. And since then, of course, astronomers have been searching, radio telescopes have been searching for signals. They found nothing, so they actually call it the Great Silence, right? Because they're not finding anything so far. Now, only a very, very small part of the universe has been searched so far, but still, it raises the question, since the development of origin of life from certain points of view seems very, very probable, and here we are, have some technological complexity, we're capable of sending radio signals and so forth, there's an appreciable probability that there ought to be other complex civilizations out there, especially since in the last, say, roughly 20 years, there have been all these developments where they've now, using new techniques, they've detected, I think the last count is well over 4,000 exoplanets, other planets around other worlds in the universe. And estimates are there's probably 2 or 3 billion Earth-like planets in our galaxy alone. So it only makes the problem worse. Where the heck are they? Since they ought to be there. So there's a whole literature on this Fermi paradox. Some of it's some of it's sort of way out there, and some of it's very, very technical. But I had heard of something called Lotka's law, and I thought that this might apply to the problem. So, very short version of this: Lotka, A.J. Lotka, was an American mathematical biologist, and he did a lot of studies of statistics. And he got interested in the question of publication of scientific papers. Right? And back in the 1920s, he looked at some databases and showed that, I think he looked in physics and chemistry, or maybe physics, chemistry, and biology, can't remember, and showed that out of the only a very, very small number of people are actually publishing most of the scientific papers, the refereed scientific papers. So, you know, maybe there's some chemist who's publishing 300, 400, or 500 papers, and most other chemists maybe publish 1 or 2 in their entire careers, or nothing, right? And so you end up this curve. You end up with a curve describing how many people are publishing versus the number of people who publish, and it becomes a hyperbola like that, and so a very small number of people are publishing most of the stuff. And people have looked at this. It's called Lotka's law, and then people have looked at this in other situations, and they find that a similar, this is called what's called a power law. So similar power law curves apply, for example, in many other fields. For example, somebody did the math on golf tournament wins. So you look at PGA tournament wins from, say, 1950 to 2000. You get another Lotka curve. Very, very small number of golfers, you know, people like Jack Nicklaus, are winning most of the events, right? And it occurs in another area where you see this is in citations of academic papers or citations of artworks. Again, you know, Beethoven gets cited enormously more often than, you know, Healy Willem, you know, and it's just there, and you get a Lotka curve again. So anyway, what's behind this? And as far as I can understand, these power laws, one area where they arise is situations where you have a binary outcome. So if it's a golf tournament, you either win or lose. There's no in between. If you're talking scientific publications, your paper is either published or it isn't. There's no such thing as having 60% publication, right? It's in between. It's binary. It's on or off. Another example is fighter pilot kills during World War II, or other situations where you find a small number of fighter pilots win most of the dogfights, and the other guys don't, you know, often don't survive. So what characterizes these things is this kind of binary on-off, win or lose. So I just made a hypothesis, and it's just a hypothesis. This isn't proven, all right? This is just a hypothesis that I put out there, and amazingly got it published in a good journal, but it's just a hypothesis, is that if you take a planet, and life evolves on this planet, and you know, hundreds of millions or billions of years go by, and that life gradually evolves and gets greater and greater complexity, but it's constantly faced with survival challenges of all sorts. And they might be climate change, they might be tectonic events like giant volcanoes, they could be impacts from outer space, which are a very important factor in Earth's history. There could be a whole bunch of things that we don't even know about, but there are these survival challenges, and they're sort of like a dogfight. You win or you lose. You either fly away, or you're going down in your parachute, or you're going down in flames. There's no in between.
You know, it just occurred to me that Lotka's law can be, it's also applicable just to the survival of species. You actually have a small number of species that survive.
Well, I think that's right. One of my projects actually is to talk to some people who know more about the mathematics of evolution than I do, and see if that's right. Is you know, is just try to understand this process that. So the point is, therefore, the very short version of this whole argument is to get to the point where you're a very complicated technological civilization capable of sending, you know, radio signals or spaceships out into deep space. you've got to pass an awful lot of these survival challenges. So, and you're going to have to climb Lotka's curve. And that's going to be hard. So even if there's a lot of planets where life can evolve, just by the mathematics of survival, very, very few may make it through to the point of very advanced complexity. So that's the gist of it.
Thank you, Kent, very much. That was a very stimulating discussion, and thank you very much for letting me interview you.
Okay, well, thanks to you, Gary. Thanks to everyone for listening. Thanks to Catherine Reeder and University of Lethbridge for setting this all up and make it possible. And I guess I'll just wish everybody out there good health and stay healthy and stay safe. And you know, and we will see everybody soon again, I'm sure.